Hello, welcome back. This is the third session of part one, and today we will conclude our topic of race and ethnicity, and then we're going to go into presenting the other fields in anthropology. Let me go to our PowerPoint. Here we go. All right, so we left off with Dr. Lopez lecture explaining the origins of how this idea of race came about and the social implications that it had and it continues to have in our society. So in this class, we don't want to minimize or try to present as race does not exist in our society. It is very much a reality that has been ingrained within our historical past that continues to divide many humans across the world, but in particular in our country. In this class, we are presenting, from the contributions of biological anthropology is trying to break this notion of race by presenting information, scientific information, that we should not judge someone by the color of their skin. As a matter of fact, our skin says very, very little about us. So breaking from that, when we're talking about anthropology, we know that there are no different races. There's only one human race. And we look at our differences and our origins from where our ancestors came from and what we learn, how we dress, what our belief systems. We look at them more of a form of ethnicity. And so let me define what ethnicity is. So when we're talking about ethnic groups, this is an identity. It's based on cultural characteristics and a shared common ancestry. So this gives us a sense of heritage. And even if you don't know, for example, where your grandparents came from or great-grandparents or so forth, down the line, you have a sense of heritage. You can research your heritage, and you'll have some markers from there based on the language or perhaps a religious practice or a distinct custom, holiday. So ethnic groups, there's different forms that they can identify to this ethnic group, but we're looking at a common ancestry, an origins, a history, a common history, a language, like I said, a religious practice, distinct patterns of dressing or certain diet taboos, diet restrictions based on customs, holidays. In some cultures, we'll look at body art and how this marks what group of people you belong to. And there's many other forms that people identify what ethnic group they belong to. But ethnicity is to the degree to which a person identifies to a particular ethnic group. And many times we use symbolic ethnicity. With symbolic ethnicity, this is something that we use more for public display rather than everyday life. In other words, only on certain holidays do we dress up a form of our expressing our cultural heritage, but we don't necessarily dress like this every day. One example is the celebration that's celebrated across the United States, that has become very popular, of Cinco de Mayo. Cinco de Mayo, throughout the United States, they celebrate it as a form of Hispanic heritage. And in many cases, there's a misunderstanding thinking that this holiday represents Mexico Independence Day. It does not. As a matter of fact, in Mexico, they don't celebrate this day at all. Mexico Independence is in September the 16th. But on this particular day, Cinco de Mayo, it has been commercialized and has become a form of public display in certain areas here in South Texas and Central Texas and South Texas. There's celebrations, parade, music, and events, and people tend to dress up in forms of Mexican attire. Right now, there's a celebration in February taking place in South Texas in what we call the Rio Grande Valley, and they are celebrating what they call Charro Days. Charro Days is a celebration where they celebrate the relationship between Mexico and the United States on the border, and they have these massive parades, and people dress up as charros and as different ethnic groups throughout Mexico, even though it's not necessarily their ethnic groups. Like they're the group of where their ancestors came from. Some may dress up as a Yucateca Maya, or in Aztec attire, or as a charro, and not necessarily have a ranch, etc. But this is a form of symbolic ethnicity. It's just an expression. It's a form of public display rather than dressing up like this every day. Whereas you go to the Yucatan, you will see women dress up in the huipils or in the ternos. This attire, this is their everyday dress. But in these forms of celebration, we just borrow from them to express our heritage. Okay, all right. So I hope this clarifies that we're going to dive into our cultural expressions and talk more about ethnicity rather than race. But even though with ethnicity, this also still carries the weight of social inequalities. Both race and ethnicity have social implications on how people look at this, either based, because of the color of their skin, this idea of race, or based on, practices, language, cultural heritage, and things like that. Okay? All right, so let's go on to another field of anthropology. This is linguistic anthropology. Linguistic anthropology, they're interested in studying human language and its relationship to culture. And when this is applied, when it goes into the field and specialization, they, in many cases, are looking to save or revive languages, or to try to understand the complexity of how language influences our development, our cognitive development, to our cultural development, and so forth. So I'm going to present a few fields in linguistic anthropology, and then I'm going to present a case study, a very famous case study in anthropology. Okay, so one of the fields within linguistics is linguistic relativity. This is the idea that language can provide information on the different ways that humans view the world. So here, for example, if I always ask my students, like, if you don't have a word for it, can you experience it? Can you understand it? What it means? So if I say the word alush to you, can you grasp what it is? And this is the answer is no. This is based, for example, certain words to a language reflect how they can view the world. And in this case of an alush, I will present the alush as we get into religion and belief systems and so forth, and my experience with the alush as well. But the Alush is a nature spirit. And this is the word Alush is a Yucateca Mayan word. And when you go to the region of the Yucatec Peninsula, you can go through, to three different states from the Yucatan, Campeche, Quintana Roo. And if you'll see that many businesses use the word Alush. It's a common name that is very ingrained into the social fabric. But also when you're in among Mayan people and you ask them for stories of the Alush, this is a nature spirit, a very mischievous nature spirit that exists throughout the Mayan world. And it is in some forms, it's Mayan priest can use it as an assistant or a protection. So in many cases, they protect properties or they protect nature. And if you come into their territory without permission, like walking into nature or somebody's agricultural plot without permission, these mischievous spirits can throw stones at you, can cause some sort of mischief to harm you, or in some cases cause illness. And the description of them, as you collect stories throughout this region, they come very similar to a description of what we would and how we view gnomes. They're very, very tiny, bearded. They describe them as almost like children-like, but that they have long beards and they work together. And they love sweets, so they must be fed. In this case, a type of sweet oatmeal made out of corn, and so forth. So I will get into the story of the Alush. But what does this tell us about the linguistic relativity of this area of Yucateca Mayans or this region? It's very much expressing the fact that they have certain names for winds. The translation of wind is ik. And when we're interviewing Mayan priests, they have enormous list of different types of winds and how they can affect humans. In certain ceremonies, they name a list of winds that carry the essence of the ancestors to bring them down and to assist humans in their petition. So the fact that we have all of these linguistic categories for winds or nature spirits, this reveals in many cases the relationship that Mayans have with nature, how they see it alive, how they see it animated. And so therefore, let's say here in the city, if one would say Alush, we wouldn't have the concept of it. But when we are within a Yucateca Mayan society and we use this phrase, we use this name, they are very much aware of its meaning. But from an anthropological, linguistic viewpoint, we see how they can view nature as very animated, as alive, and as having agency, having willpower, etc. Okay, so another field in linguistic anthropology is descriptive linguistics. Descriptive linguistics, these are anthropologists and linguistic specialists that go into the field and they are describing and trying to translate the sound of language in writing. They're trying to save it, or in many cases revive it. There are many cultures, just here, in the United States, Native American cultures, that while their language is based on oral tradition, they do not have written records. And therefore, if this tradition is not passed on, the languages are lost. And in these cases, this is where linguistic anthropologists working with cultural anthropologists and doing field work, they can collect a series of words and phrases and concepts, create written records for them to be able to pass on to generations. So they're hoping save it or revive it. Historical linguistics is they're looking at the change of language throughout time and also across culture. And one of our very modern adaptation or interest in historical linguistics is how they have had to add acronyms, texting, things to the dictionary. So these are where dictionaries are always having to be updated because our language is constantly changing and we keep giving different meanings to expressions, to sounds, and so forth, and the way we write certain words, etc. Ethno-linguistics. Ethno-linguistics is similar to linguistic relativity, but ethno-linguistics, they're looking at language and culture and how culture and the environment influences the language. One example that we'll present here is the Inuits when they have over 30 words for identifying snow. And if you live in this environment, in this Arctic environment, which is it's a harsh environment for survival, it is essential to know the different types of snow because it could be very fatal, and to know what snow you can step on. So they have over 30 different descriptions for snow. So this is also, goes hands in hands with linguistic relativity in a sense. And social linguistics also is looking at culture, but they're looking at the social context of it, how we use language in different settings, in different situations. From here, we can look at expressions of how we express ourselves from a professional to a casual manner. How we use expressions on gender, on age, on just certain modes of just our social construct. One example is code switch. Code switch is the linguistic ability to go back and forth alternating from different languages, or sometimes combining the languages. One example is switching from Spanish to English, or vice versa. Or in many cases, it has created a new form of language called Spanglish that we find most commonly here in Texas. So the ability to know, okay, I'm in a cultural setting and I can communicate in Spanish. Many people that are bilingual, everybody that's bilingual does this. Depending on their cultural setting, they will be code switching. So this is social linguistic. They're looking at, okay, when do people do this and why? And how are sometimes certain words combined and recreate meaning and so forth. All right, so why are we interested in language? Well, language is one of the very distinct features of humans. Language is a symbolic form of expression. When we think about it, you're able to understand what I'm saying because, one, you understand this language, but mostly when we go into the deeper form, you're able to understand the sounds, the expressions, the facial expressions, but also the vocal sounds that I am using. Language is a combination of sounds and gestures, and that is why we have different languages, and and you have to be able to understand what these sounds and gestures, what the meaning, what meaning they're conveying. And language, while it includes sounds, it doesn't. In many cases, new forms of language are created, such as American Sign Language. This is a language based also, the sound, it carries sound as a form of expression, punctuation. For example, you would be able to tell if I'm upset because I'm able to raise my voice and make certain facial gestures that are conveying that this is a moment of stress or anger. And so how is this conveyed in American Sign Language if it's pretty much gestures? They also carry sound in their form of expressions and in their way of communicating. Let's say, for example, I'm asking a question. This is the sign for what? Let's say I want to ask what did you say, or what did you ask? So is he like what did you say, or what did you ask? What was your question? That is an inquiry. You're able to tell by my facial expression and also by the movement of my hand. But if I were upset and trying to convey this in sign language, you would also be able to tell quickly. Let's say this is a confrontation and I'm want to scream, what did you say? I would say it like this, like what did you say? It would be, it's more of the expressions and the sound come in how intense the sign is coming across. Okay? All right. So again, going back to language. Language, when we think about it, is one of the most distinct features one of the most distinct features in all creations here on Earth. One of the most distinct features for human beings. And scientists have been interested in understanding if other life on Earth has this form, this complexity of language. And so they've studied animals, they've studied primates. Most of the studies are done within primates and other animals such as whales. And they have determined that yes, primates do have language, and they do have the ability to learn language as humans, but not to the point, not to this level of complexity that we are able to convey. When we put together sounds and meanings and expressions, these become very elaborate. We have developed grammar as a form, of rules that give meaning, etc. So there's, if you'd be interested in learning more about linguistic anthropology, there's very, very interesting studies on this, and in particular, great studies done with primates. If they have been able to acquire our vocal expressions, mimic our vocal expressions, and also learn gestures such as and a form of language as using American Sign Language, and so forth. So, okay, so today I'm going to present a case study. A very famous case study that looked at how humans, the debate of how humans acquire language. And this is a debate that emerged in the 70s. And with this, this gave great strength to the field of linguistics, anthropology, because in the very center, and when we go into theory, you'll understand the whole cultural concept of everything that was going on during this time and how anthropology was really coming into the public sphere, how it was becoming, a field of great interest and contribution in all fields of studies, from politics to cultures and social movements and so forth, in this case, linguistics. The debate on the social realm was nature versus nurture. And this is going to come up again. The nature versus nurture is the debate, and we still kind of see it in our present academic and debates and things like that. But nature is basically saying you're hardwired that way. Your genetics make you the way you are, the way you behave, your ability to learn. Your brain has, in the case of language, your brain has this innate, it's already hardwired, just activated to learn language. And the nurture debate says, no, we are molded. We reflect our environment. We could be molded into something that reflects our environment. So it is really how we are nurtured, how we nurture the human being, how we nurture the human brain that reflects our ability, in this case, to learn language, and in other cases, it reflects the ability of how we behave. So let's look at the two theorists that made this debate, and this became a very famous debate. I mean, it would come out in the newspapers. There were, documentaries done about it. This became like part of your everyday conversation. This debate that we have now, we're hardwired. It's our nature to do this, or no, it's our environment that is influencing everything about us. So one famous linguistics, and he's still around, still very renowned, is Noam Chomsky. In the 70s, he presented what we call universal grammar theory. And here he's saying that the human brain is hardwired to learn language. It's just part of our cognitive structure, our brain structure. So it doesn't matter if you are in the right environment. It's not the nurture that gives you your ability to learn the language. So there's already sets of principles and rules that one can acquire language. Now here's the thing: at any time, So the debate came from Eric Lenenberg, and he stated, his debate came about, says, well, humans may have the cognitive ability to learn language, but there is a critical period that language must be learned. And this is called the critical period hypothesis, which basically states that language, yes, while it is innate, we do come with this hardwire to do so. It must be learned and must be attained before the age of puberty to fully acquire the language. In other words, to fully acquire the syntax, the meaning, the grammar, everything that encompasses language, it must be learned at an early stage, and therefore this depends a lot of our nurture. Okay, so for this debate, while this debate was heavy in across universities, colleges, and becoming part of the public sphere, because you'll learn later on other issues that were taking place socially that this nature versus nurture debate was the focal point of it. For linguistic anthropology, this horrific situation presented itself that provided the testing ground for these hypotheses. Remember, when we are studying, when we're trying to apply certain scientific theories or on humans, it's very complex because, in particular, learning language, when they're trying to learn how a human being develops language and how either their environment or something else will affect them, there's a lot of ethics involved. This is a very, delicate studies that you won't get permission to do this because of the consequences of this. Where, putting humans into a lab in a lab to study and influencing their environment to see their outcome is not ethical. So therefore, these two theories were not able to really apply. When you study linguistics, you'll see that some linguistics applied certain things within their children, such as bringing in a chimpanzee with their with their infant and teaching him both language, and then learning that while the chimpanzee was learning forms of expression and behavior as the human baby as it entered toddlerhood started actually mimicking more the ape and so forth. So, but again, these are things that scientists did within their families and documented and had these outcomes, but this is not something that you would be able to recreate in a lab with permission because of the consequences that it could have on humans. But in this case, a situation came about where a girl was found, and the case of Genie Wiley. Now, Genie Wiley, when she was found, she was about 12 years old, and she had been isolated in her bedroom for 12 years. She had never seen the light of day, had socialized, been in school. Her situation was of severe abuse. Her father locked her up and also had her handcuffed to the bed, and she suffered isolation, and we would consider her a feral child. In many of these cases of linguistic anthropology, they study feral children. These are children that have been born in the wild, that have been raised by, feral children are children that have been raised by animals. And there have been cases throughout the world, and when you look in linguistic anthropology, linguistics, when they have come across cases of feral children that have been raised by animals, they start working with them and trying to apply to see how they communicate with animals, but also if they're able to learn language. Well, in the case of Genie Wiley, while she was not raised by animals, she was raised by abusive humans. Her case presented the situation of isolation, of not being nurtured, and of being isolated in this horrific situation. And her father isolated her, thinking she had at a very young age, because she was a girl and because he considered her to have some sort of intellectual disability. She did have another brother, and her mother live there, but they would still not socialize with her and so forth. So she was fed, chained up to a bed, had her porta potty there, etc. And so when she was discovered, it presented the situation, this case study for linguistic anthropologists to say, all right, we have this child that has not been nurtured almost to her teenage years. So therefore, if universal grammar is correct, then with the right type of environment and exposure, she would have the ability to learn language, even though she didn't learn it at a very young age. And this would put both theories to the test. So is there a critical period? Because she was isolated for this long and she's already into puberty, she will not have the ability to learn language, or our brains are hardwired, and if activated correctly, they will have the ability to learn language despite her age and situation. Okay, so we're gonna put a short video, and I want you to make note of this debate of the two theories of Noam Chomsky debate, Eric Lindenberg, and see how this is applied to the case of Genie Wiley. See if she is able to understand syntax, which this is the system of rules of combining words to make meaning. So again, because sounds, just because a sound is made doesn't necessarily mean that it makes up a word. The sounds have to be put together and create meaning to create language. And there are rules that within every language that give this meaning, which is called syntax. So see if when you're looking at this case, think about the debate, nurture versus nature, and answer the question if Genie Wiley was able to learn syntax. Let me start the video.
Was kept in such isolation by her parents that she never even learned to talk. The girl still wore diapers and was uttering infantile noises when a social worker discovered the case 2 weeks ago. But the authorities are hoping she still may have a normal learning capacity.
Among the first to see the child was Temple City Detective Sergeant Frank Lindley.
I already knew that the child was 13 and a half years old. And I took one look at her, and she wasn't much bigger than my daughter Beverly, who had just turned 7 about 3 months earlier. And I really had a hard time conceiving of the idea that the child was the age that she was. The child obviously had been severely mistreated. She was still in diapers, couldn't walk. She had no verbal skills at all at that point. The last time I was on this street was probably 30 years ago. Yep, there it is. Hasn't changed much. The backyard looks the same. It's all weeds and dead grass. Looks the same as it did in 1970.
The house belonged to Clark Wiley. A loner, Clark had turned his back on the world after his mother had been killed in a hit-and-run accident. After the accident, things in the Wiley house would never be the same again.
The house was completely dark. All the blinds were drawn. And there were no toys, no clothes, nothing that would ever indicate to you that a child of any age lived there. The child's bedroom was back in this corner. That was the bedroom. The windows were covered to about 3 inches from the top, which was the only natural light that had ever come in there in all the time the child was in the bedroom. The entire furnishings of the bedroom consist of a cage with a pull-down chicken wire lid and some type of piece of wire securing it when they closed it down. There was a potty chair with some kind of homemade strapping device.
For 13 years, Genie had spent her nights locked in bed, her days strapped to a potty chair. During that time, Clark had ordered his son John and wife Irene never to talk to her. In her darkened room, she had led a life of near total isolation. Even close neighbors were completely unaware of her presence.
We came home from work and the police was here and they came to question us. That's when we found out, what happened and, that they had a little girl. Nobody knew before. And when we found out what happened and how she was treated, I mean, everybody was shocked and just unbelievable.
For their whole marriage, Clark had imposed his will on Irene. And blind with cataracts, she had been too scared to resist. But one day, something broke. While Clark was out buying groceries, she seized her chance and fled. It was the first glimpse the world would have of Clark and Irene's dark secret.
I met Clark and Irene at Temple City Sheriff's Station. They were both under arrest at the time. When we interviewed Irene, she would make no mention of the family whatsoever, particularly the children. I attempted, along with my partner, to interview Clark. He refused to talk to us. He wouldn't say a word. He never even acknowledged that he understood what we were talking about.
Mr. Wiley?
Yes.
Why did you keep your daughter in a room?
Mr. Wiley has no comment.
No comment.
We haven't had time to discuss the charge. We haven't even seen them.
Unable to face the truth, Clark took matters into his own hands.
This morning, the authorities reported that 70-year-old Clark Wiley shot and killed himself just before he was to go to court and be arraigned for child abuse.
After 13 years, Genie was at last free. And for scientists, she was just the case they had been waiting for. For 13 years, Genie had lived a life of complete isolation. Raised in a city bedroom, Genie was as much a feral child as if she had been brought up by wolves. At 13, she was the size of a 6-year-old. Worst of all, she had never been taught to speak. The question now, could she ever learn? Genie's case was so scientifically important that the government funded a team of scientists to help answer the many questions she posed. Two of the scientists who would become especially important to Genie were child psychologist James Kent and linguist Susan Curtis. Neither had ever encountered a case as extreme as Genie's.
We looked at her as a newborn in a way, even though we know she hadn't. She came with 13 years of memories and experiences, not all of them wonderful, most of them not, I think. And so we thought we needed to start to expose her to what the world was going to be like for her outside the hospital bed.
To Genie, everything was a new experience.
We did what you would do with your own kids if you were introducing them to the world. You'd take them out and hold them up and show them, and sort of judge from how they reacted to whether this was too much or not enough, and you could move on and do the next thing.
Genie was making amazing progress. As the experts looked on, they realized that she might be the answer to the question that had troubled science for so long.
So we seized this wonderful opportunity that she provided us in as loving a way as we could, but using it to finally get our chance to address head-on specific hypotheses and notions about human language and the human mind.
These hypotheses were based on the latest ideas about how children's brains developed. According to the theory, young children could only learn certain things at certain times, called critical periods. Language was one of these critical periods, and according to the theory, Genie, who was now a teenager, had missed her chance forever. But incredibly, Genie seemed to be proving the theory wrong. As this footage shows, Genie was blossoming. Not only was she delighted by the world around her, but she was learning the words for the new things she was seeing.
She was extremely interested in everything around her. She wanted to know the word for everything around her. She wanted to engage people all around her. She was not mentally deficient. Her lights were on, and everyone who worked with her, from teachers to therapists to me, knew that she was not retarded. It was clear as day. And as she began to learn more and more words, hundreds of words, much more rapidly than I ever imagined, and stringing them together, I began to think maybe I will be wrong. Maybe she will be the one that will prove that this hypothesis is incorrect.
But Genie could not escape the effects of her past so easily. She was still haunted by her traumatic upbringing, trapped by the memories of the awful fate she had suffered. And linguistically, she had stopped making progress.
She learned tons of words. She has an enormous vocabulary. But language is not words. Language is grammar. Language is sentences. How do you make a sentence? What can be a sentence? What is a sentence? How do you automatically know something's a sentence? So it wasn't because she was cognitively deficient. In other respects, it was because she was cognitively deficient in this island of human mind, the mental faculty that we call grammar.
At the time Genie was found, brain science was in its infancy. But today, we have a much clearer picture of what actually happens in cases of extreme neglect like Genie's.
In Genie's brain, the left part of her brain, her cortex, that has those neural systems responsible for speech and language, because she never heard any words and because she was never spoken to very often, they didn't get stimulated. And because they weren't stimulated, they got smaller and less functional and disconnected, and ultimately that part of the brain literally physically changes.
Today, with modern imaging technology, we can actually see what happens in the brains of feral children, and the effects are shocking. Without normal stimulation, their brains are smaller and malformed, and the earlier this neglect begins, and the longer it carries on, the worse the damage will be. Starved of stimulation, Genie's brain had simply not developed the capacity for language. And now that she was a teenager, she would never be able to learn. Despite this, Genie continued to be a close part of everyone's life, but there was more trouble ahead.
Children have to belong to somebody when they grow up, and she was still a child, and she needed a family to belong to. So that's what we would have liked, a family that she could belong to. And that's not what happened, unfortunately. What did happen is about the worst outcome I think we would have envisioned.
On her 18th birthday, Genie moved back with her mother Irene into the house in which she had been so terribly abused. But after only a few weeks, it was clear that Irene couldn't cope. From here, Genie was moved into state care with terrible consequences.
I was a student, and people wouldn't listen to me. People who needed to intervene did not listen to me. And so I spent lots and lots of time on the phone pleading with people to intervene and save this person who had had the worst experience of deprivation and isolation in all recorded medical history.
Genie moved from home to home, sometimes with the very people who served as her therapists. This potential conflict of interests raised tensions among the many people involved in her life, and a tug of war erupted over the child. As Genie's condition deteriorated, Irene decided that Susan Curtis and the other academics had become too close to Genie. A lawsuit followed.
I went from being asked to be her guardian to 1 week later being prevented from seeing her or phoning her. And ever since then, I've been prevented from having any contact at all. So, although I have lots of, I'm still a scientist, I'm still interested in knowing things about her language now and all kinds of interesting things I would like to pursue academically. Primarily, I would just like to see her.
Now, a ward of the court, Genie lives in an adult care home somewhere in Los Angeles, prevented from seeing the people who once meant so much to her.
Let me switch back to this. Okay. All right, as we saw, that is a horrible, horrible situation. And it's not the only one, unfortunately, that has happened. There have been many cases of children that are in abusive situations and are isolated. But Genie Wiley's case became a public debate. It became, your popular news. And in the results, the situation, as I was explaining, when we're conducting research and including humans, it is very complex because of the potential outcome and the effects that this could have. And Genie Wiley's case also brought that into debate, how these scientists were perhaps influencing her life. And then, so the debate was really never settled, to say the least. Noam Chomsky argued that it was a trauma. It was a trauma that impacted her ability to develop, to acquire a language, while Lenenberg argued that we missed that critical period. We missed that very critical moment. We know that children before the age of 6 can acquire multiple language without having a confusion, being able to code switch easily. Without having this confusion of meaning and so forth. And yet, as adults, we do have the ability to learn a new language, but it takes a lot longer and a lot more greater effort than it does for a child to learn several languages. So, unfortunately, this debate was not settled concrete, but we do know that she was not able to acquire what they would call the rules of language, syntax, grammar, to be able to convey these meanings. While she was able to mimic or express words, the rules for being able to relay the meaning were not there at that moment, and then from there it just got more complicated in which she suffered. Okay, all right. So this will be the case of Genie Wiley will be a question for the linguistic parts, for the linguistic aspect of it. Okay, so let's go on to another field of anthropology. This is archaeology. Archaeology are interested in understanding humans by studying their material remains. They're, just like forensic anthropologists that are looking at the remains of the human bodies, of bones, and trying to piece back together the story of who that person was, how old that person was, and so forth. Of course, they work hand in hand with archaeology. Archaeologists in putting together the whole story, but also looking at other remains, our artifacts, human tools, where they were placed and how they were used, and looking at the materials and so forth. They're trying to reconstruct past behaviors, past belief systems, trying to understand early humans and their adaptation to their environment, trying to learn from perhaps their mistakes or what took place in their environment, trying to look at their evolution. So they work very closely when we're looking at human remains, or work very closely with biological anthropologists, in this case forensic anthropologists. is to carry out an archaeological excavation or piecing together the stories. Here in the U.S. And in Canada, there's a Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And this is from the Cultural Resource Management. This is basically from the government to, as we're excavating and expanding our infrastructure, our highways, development, so forth, across our country, there is this agreement that if in an excavation, as they're trying, let's say, putting in a highway, when they're excavating, if they come across artifacts, if they come across human remains, they bring in archaeologists to determine if what this is, what remains, who they belong to. And there's the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act that if anything is found that belongs to Native Americans, it is a federal law that these items must be returned based on the lineage, on their descendants. Okay? And so archaeologists, they're very interested. In many cases, we're looking at how they're piecing the past. And very interesting, today with technology, they have new tools that are less invasive. In other words, they don't need to dig that deep to understand what is beneath a structure. And so with this new geophysical survey, which is, it's like sonar mapping, it's archaeological imaging mapping. We know now that there are so many pyramids and structures throughout Latin America that connect all the way into the Amazons. There are massive cities that have still remained to be discovered. But the reality is there is just not the funds to do this, because this is a very costly undertaking as well as a timely and human effort to do so. At the moment, in the Yucatan, the president ordered, it's a project that's still ongoing, and I think it still needs about a year or two, probably by 2024 it should be completed. But they are installing a train that will connect the three states of the Yucatan Peninsula, which are the Yucatan, Campeche, and Quintana Roo. And they are connecting all, not all the Mayan cities, but they are connecting some of the Mayan cities, providing this form of transportation, tourist transportation, to reconnect and go through the jungle. Because this area, there are some areas, for example, I'm sure you've heard of the famous pyramid of Chichen Itza in Quintana Roo. And this is one of the wonders of the world. It has millions of tourists come to this region just to visit this site. But without the region, there are many other sites, and there's some states, as in the state of Campeche, that their archaeological sites are older and bigger, but yet the infrastructure to take tourism there was not in place. And there's still a lot of forest, a lot of jungle. And so this train is going to cross from the Caribbean all the way to inland Yucatan, all the way into the forest, into the jungle. And so in the making of this train, it has brought up a lot of debate in Mexico as far as deforestation, and also in archaeology, because, as I mentioned, there are so many cities there in this region. And when they're excavating, archaeologists are called into play, and they quickly have to determine what scale of importance is this city. And if it's not of high importance, ranking from 1 to 4, then they continue the construction of that train to pass through that site. Instead of conducting a full excavation and restoration of the site. Now, I lived in the Yucatan for many years throughout the times, and I've lived in different parts of the region. And I was always, just so struck. I would go to a local park, and there would be a structure there that had been excavated in subdivisions. Within the subdivision, there were 1 or 2 structures, pyramid structures, that were there. So within, this, just the city alone, just the city, the urban city, there was over 700 sites within, the urban setting. And this is not to mention within the rural setting and within the forest, within the jungle, that is still has been, is still pending to be excavated. Okay, going back to the tools that archaeology is now using. And this I found very interesting because throughout my visit and my research, I collected stories from Mayan priests and from local Mayans that have been passed on, and about the ancestors, about the ancient Mayas. And one of those stories included that all the cities connect underground. That underground, there are underground tunnels that the ancient Mayas used. The ancient Mayans had highways. They had they created highways to connect to cities. So we do know this. These are called the white roads, or sakbe, which are still found throughout the forest, and so we know that they created roads, and in some cases almost highways, where they had to elevate these roads to cross a certain topography. But within oral tradition, within the Maya stories, they would talk about how not only was there sakbes, these highways, these roads that the ancient Mayans used, but they also connected underground through the cenotes. And in recent years, using this technology, they were able to discover that the pyramid, the famous pyramid of Chichen Itza, is actually sitting on top of a cenote. What is a cenote? A cenote is a sinkhole. It's a water sinkhole. It's a sinkhole, so it's a big hole underground, and in the bottom it has an underground current. You could call it like a river connecting, and that eventually leads out into the ocean. But throughout this region of the Yucatan, the type of topography, it's a very limestone, rocky topography, and you find these water holes, these cenotes, with fresh water. And this is where, these civilizations also gathered water from, aside from collecting rainwater. But many of these were considered sacred. Many of these were used as offering sites for ceremonies, where many lineages, different groups of Mayas would travel in particular to make offerings to these cenotes. And in Chichen Itza, within that archaeological site, there is a very famous cenote there within this structure. But using this radar technology, they discovered that it is also sitting on top of a cenote. So you have to think about the archaeological wonder of architectural wonder of creating this, of building this structure over this, and the years, that it has sustained there. I'm going to put a quick video of one of the archaeologists, and it's in Spanish, but it does have the subtitles for you to follow that explains the discovery of this. Here we go. I'm going to play it here. It's on your PowerPoint, but since you're not able to see it through this video, I'm going to play it here for you.
Geologists and geophysicists of the National Autonomous University of Mexico announced the discovery of a new cenote beneath the castle pyramid at Chichen Itza. According to the opinion of the archaeologist Guillermo de Anda, this new information could bring answers to questions regarding the construction of this enigmatic building.
Es muy probable que este cenote sea el axis mundi, es decir, el eje del mundo, el centro del mundo desde la cosmovisión maya de los pobladores de Chichén, y por eso está erigido el castillo también con ciertas características.
According to the National Geographic Explorer, for many years, researchers such as Alfonso Marquina and John Carson had an idea of the existence of peculiarities regarding the construction of the castle and its location, in reference with the sacred cenote and the Xtoloc cenote.
Estoy casi seguro que los antiguos mayas sabían de la existencia de ese lugar y por eso construyen el castillo encima. Ni siquiera lo construyen totalmente encima, tienen el cuidado de no abarcar toda la bóveda, pues tal vez por temor a que se les derrumbara. Los mayas no dejaban nada a la casualidad en cuanto a sus ceremonias o la edificación de un edificio.
Because of its alignment with the sacred cenote and the Xtoloc cenote, De Anda thinks that the newly discovered cenote may contain an offering to the building, which is why the Maya would have defined this place as the center of their world.
Este cenote nuevo no lo conocemos, no sabemos cómo es, pero por lo que nos dicen los geofísicos se parece mucho a Fortún. Es como otro Fortún, una gran bóveda con agua abajo, que fue muy probablemente sellado ritualmente por los mayas. Si no me equivoco, en mis hipótesis, la próxima temporada los geofísicos encontrarán algún túnel y alguna entrada sellada al cenote.
Meanwhile, researchers continue to work with UNAM electrode technology to scan the basement of Chichen Itza and perhaps find the long sought after entrance to the Maya underworld.
Here we go. Yeah, so I personally found this fascinating that while I had collected stories previous to this discovery, when this, and they would talk about the Pyramid of Chichen Itza, the greatest archaeological sites have tunnels underneath through the cenotes. And we do know there are some archaeological sites that do connect one of the main structures, and it exits out through the cenote. So that's why this was fascinating when they came up with this information. And the Maya still hold stories about the axis mundi, the center of the world. That they talk about, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in the prophecies and stories, but they mention the axis mundi for them is, they refer to it as the umbilical cord to the world, that there is a connection to the center of the world in this region and so forth. And then the ancient Mayans knew this. Okay, so archaeologists, while they're trying to piece together the past and learn from the past, from humans from the past, their remains, their construction, and how they gave meaning, and what environments and so forth, behaviors they had. This is not necessarily, archaeology is not necessarily something of the past. On the contrary, there is now contemporary archaeology. There is a very interesting study, and it's called the Garbage Project, and this was conducted by Professor William Rathke from the University of Tucson, Arizona. And so what this professor came about is he started studying our garbage, started studying our how we dispose of our garbage and what it says about us as a society. And one of his projects, very interesting projects that he did with his students, and they selected certain subdivisions. I forgot how they came about selecting these locations, but they selected certain subdivisions and they said, okay, let's go out and survey the area. Let's ask people these questions, very simple questions about, their consumption and their behavior. One of the questions was asking people if they consumed beer, if they consumed, how much beer they consumed, and so forth. And only about 15% of the subdivision said that they admitted that they consumed beer, but that they only drank less than 8 beers per week. And so this is what people said. So what the Garbage Project does is, okay, well, this is what they said, but now let's go into the trash. And they were excavating the subdivision's trash, and what they discovered was that what people say and what they do is completely different. And they discovered that 80% of the household actually consumed beer, and over 50% of the household consumed more than 8 beers per week. So his contribution to this is, when we're conducting surveys, what people say they do and what they actually do are two different things. And these are something that we must take always into account. And this is why in the case of anthropology, cultural anthropology, and this, we'll pick up on this next, one of the things is that we conduct field work. We're there, people say they do something, but we try to integrate ourselves as much as we can into everyday life to confirm if this is what they do and how they do things. But in the case of surveys, this is the debate. One of the things he brought into light is when we're just conducting surveys, whether online or in person or so forth, we're collecting opinion. What people say they do is not necessarily what they actually do. So it questions of how valid these questionnaires are and the information, just to make us aware. I'm going to show you a quick video on his project, because the other contribution that he brings to light is...
I'm an archaeologist.
Excuse me. The other thing he brings into light is what we are doing with our trash. We have made great advancements in technology, in science, and medicine, and everything, but yet we still do not have a grasp of what to do with our landfills. And this is a problem of what we're doing now and how it will affect us in the future. However, his excavations also brought about the issues of recycling, ideas of recycling, trying to push more influence, more of on a public scale, recycling, and also, what people say they actually recycle is not necessarily true. The other thing he brings about is how certain foods decompose. And for example, he won't talk about it, I don't think, in this video, but he talks about it in the study, excavating certain foods, like vegetables, lettuce, things like that we would think decompose quite quickly, actually do not decompose that fast. So the question is, what are we putting into our foods, and how will this affect our health? So his research brought awareness not only into the need to recycle, but what the process of how things decompose, and also the process of what people say they do is not what they actually do. Let's look at this quick video as he explains his project.
I was trained to learn about ancient societies by digging up, sorting through, and analyzing ancient garbage.
Professor Bill Rathje isn't just talking trash, he's digging it.
We're trying to look at today's society the way an archaeologist will in 1,000 years without waiting that long. All of the daily aspects of our lives, what we eat, how we clean, how we have a good time, it's all buried in here. People think I'm nuts. This is the heart and pulse of America, right here. Nowhere else. This is where it all ends up.
Feeling that heartbeat is why Rathje helped start the University of Arizona's Garbage Project in 1973. These garbologists perform large-scale excavations at landfills across the country. A special machine is used to bore down 100 feet into the trash heap to pull out piles of old garbage. Team members sort and sift through the waste, bag it, tag it, then categorize it.
The weight is 16 ounces solid. Brand is Armor.
The deeper the digging, the older the trash.
Be nice if we could get a good date right off. Coupon void after October 13th, 1963. We're getting a good cross-section of what's in the landfill so that we can get a good idea of what was thrown in, when, and what's happening to it.
You might expect food products to break down and magically disappear. Rubbish, says Rathje.
A lot of people believe when you throw paper and food debris and yard waste into a landfill, it will biodegrade and disappear. And that just doesn't happen. Food debris and yard waste, about 50% of it will biodegrade in the first 15 years. And then it stabilizes.
But the rest of the garbage that makes up a landfill isn't going anywhere for a very long time.
As far as we know, there's no real significant difference in how long it's going to take paper or styrofoam or plastic of any kind to decompose. A lot of people think that landfills are being filled up by fast food packaging, styrofoam, and disposable diapers.
But paper is a recyclable material, yet it accounts for 16 times more volume than the total amount of those so-called environmental bad guys. Translation, too much paper is being trashed.
One of the most interesting things to me is that when you study the packaging and the food remains and the recyclables at a landfill, it tells you a different story about us than when you ask people what they eat and drink, what they recycle, what they throw away. And that's because we like to think that we're recycling everything. We like to think that we're doing the right things. You get the reality here at a landfill.
And the reality is we need to do a better job recycling.
A phone book. Look at this, the archaeological record of a lost civilization.
Lost? Not yet. These remnants tell the tale not only where we've been, but also where we're headed.
We're in what archaeologists call a classic period. That means we're at our peak. Everything's going great for us. Resources are pouring in, and we're wasting them at an incredible rate. Sooner or later, the resources dry up, and eventually they collapse. This is not a gloom and doom perspective. This is a perspective based on studying hundreds of civilizations that have come before us. They've all gone through the same cycle. We should definitely learn from the past. We can make our cycle better and more fun to be in by knowing a lot about how to create less garbage.
All right, so we will end it there and just leave you with those questions to ponder on how we deal with our garbage, what needs to be done, what we're learning from this contemporary archaeology study. And thank you.